adapting to climate change. Asian cities ready for the challenge? My name is Ng Si Min and I'm your MC for today. Today's session is jointly organized by the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions and the Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies. We're delighted to have Professor Koh Lian Ping, Director of the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, to deliver the opening address. Prof. Koh, please.
Thanks very much, Simin, and a very good morning or good afternoon, good evening to all of you wherever you are. It's a really great pleasure and honor for me to be involved in co-organizing this event, as well as to have the opportunity to talk to you in this welcome speech. So I thought, given my interest in nature-based solutions, I will take the opportunity to also give a broad overview of the potential of nature-based solutions that perhaps some of you who may be more interested in solutions in the urban context may also be interested to know what nature can do for us. So please allow me to share the screen, the organizers. Yeah, thank you. Good. So I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Great,
yes.
great. So I think just 2 or 3 slides to my short speech. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, I think one of the first questions we would want to ask is a question about scale. What is the scale of the problem versus the scale of our solutions? We know that global carbon emissions is currently at about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide or equivalent emitted per year. And here on the slide, you also see the emissions from China, US, as well as Indonesia and Singapore, just for some comparison. Now, our research from the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions recently showed that by protecting threatened forests across the tropics, we can avoid the loss of almost 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. And this is what we mean by a nature-based climate solution. And this amount of 2 billion tons per year is greater than the emissions of Indonesia and Singapore combined, as you can already see on this slide. Our research also shows that by protecting just one type of those forests, and specifically by protecting threatened mangrove forests, so mangrove forests are the forests that grow on our coastal areas, we can already avoid the loss of some 30 million tons of CO2 per year. And that is not all. Coming back to the urban context, we also find that there are about 11 million hectares of urban green spaces worldwide that are potentially available for reforestation. And if we manage to reforest these green spaces across these cities, they could contribute to carbon capture at a rate of approximately 80 million tons of CO2 per year at the global level. So those are important considerations. But from the perspective of a policymaker or an investor, it may not be enough to know what this potential is, what the potential of nature-based solutions is. They also need to know where the potential lies. And so we've also produced a series of what we call carbon prospecting maps to show where in the world one can invest in forest protection to avoid carbon emissions. And looking at this map, we see that much of the potential lies in South America and Southeast Asia. In fact, Indonesia and Malaysia are among the top 5 countries in the world where we can avoid the most carbon emissions by protecting their forests. And finally, on this other map, we see that the financial return on investment from these nature-based carbon projects can be quite substantial too. And based on very conservative carbon pricing scenarios, we find that the Asia-Pacific region has the highest concentration of the most profitable carbon projects. So if we invest in these projects, generate carbon credits, and we trade carbon credits internationally, some of these projects across the Asia-Pacific region can generate returns on investment at close to $25 billion in net present values per year, every year, for the next 30 years. Indonesia alone can generate some 10 billion US dollars per year, again, every year for the next 30 years. So these so-called nature-based climate solutions can be very important, both in terms of their climate mitigation and adaptation benefits, as well as potentially creating new green growth opportunities for many countries and companies in our part of the world. And with that, I think I'll stop sharing my slides and also sharing my science. And I'd just like to, again, welcome all of you to this important event. And I'm looking forward to a series of very exciting talks that are lined up for the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Koh. Next, Director of the Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies, Professor Sing Tian Fu, will introduce our speakers for today. Prof. Sing, please.
Thanks, Sing. Good morning and good evening. Thanks, Limping, for the welcome speech, and also thank you, Limping's Center for Nature-Based Climate Solution for co-hosting the today event with us. Today, I have the privilege to introduce two very distinguished academic and also speakers who are going to share with us some of these on this topic of adapting to climate change. Asian cities ready for the challenges. And first, let me introduce the first speakers, Professor Matthew Egan. He's actually formerly of Low Tak Kong chair professor, visiting professor at NUS, and currently he's the provost professor from Department of Economics, University of Southern California. His research specialties are mainly in environmental and urban economics. He has his PhD in economics from University of Chicago. He has written several books, very interesting books, and the latest one is on adapting to climate change, and there are other books on climate police and blue sky, over Beijing, economic growth and environment in China. I think he also writing a new books on creating a better world after pandemics. Looking forward to the books. And our second speaker is a colleague from Department of Biological Science. He's Professor Roman Kalosco. He's actually currently the assistant head of Departments of Biological Science. He has his PhD in environmental research from Imperial College London, UK. His research specialties include conservation science, ecological economics, sustainability science, and environmental health. I think today's formats, we have the two speakers who will give us a presentation on the topics as indicated here: climate change and urban growth, the mitigation and adaptation challenge by Professor Khan, and then Professor Carlos will talk about climate change threats to urban well-being, the role of nature-based solution. Each of them will give about 20 to 25 minute presentation, then we'll follow by the Q&A session. First, let me welcome the first speaker, Professor Matthew Khan, to kickstart the presentation today. Matt, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Folks, greetings from New York City. So I'm here to see my parents, and I have not seen them for 2 years. They remembered me, and it's wonderful. I have such happy memories of visiting the National University of Singapore and my many friends in Singapore. Folks, this is going to be an economics talk. I hope it's an interesting talk. I see 2 people just entered the room. That is terrific. Folks, here we go. As you know, coming out of COP26, we face this challenge of climate change. And I have a son who's studying economics at the University of Chicago. I'm very concerned about the next generation's future. I loved what the previous speaker was saying about thinking creatively about sequestering carbon throughout Asia. These are very important ideas for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I'm very worried that the world's total greenhouse gas emissions will continue to rise. In my discussions in Singapore with Tian Fu, he taught me about Malaysia. I learned so much about Asia outside of China and what I see. And I want all of Asia to have similar economic growth as Singapore. the Singapore growth miracle is wonderful. And I think that we need the middle class to grow all throughout the world. Of course, an unintended consequence of people achieving their American dream is more greenhouse gas emissions. Energy consumption in the developing world is going to soar. And I want the grid to decarbonize. I know there's going to be electric vehicles, but with the growth of energy consumption, as middle class people seek to achieve their conception of the good life, there's just going to be more air conditioning. There's going to be more energy used in the agricultural sector and in the household sector, in the industrial sector. And I'm worried that we are running this experiment of ever rising greenhouse gas emissions. I would love to be wrong about this, but even at COP26, not enough momentum to bend the curve. Folks, as an economist, I am worried about the following risks for people in Asia: increased death risk from extreme heat, reduced worker and farmland productivity, natural disasters overwhelming urban infrastructure, real estate. I lived in some wonderful buildings in Singapore, and they were built quite well. But in other parts of Asia, real estate not built so well if there's extreme rainfall, if there's extreme heat. The poor bear the greatest burden from these shocks because they have the least capacity to protect themselves. Folks, the bottom bullet point is one of my key themes, and I'm keeping an eye on Tian Fu to see if he's enjoying my presentation. If we can anticipate the challenges we will face, then we, as risk-averse, smart people and political leaders, we can take proactive steps to protect ourselves from this risk. So when I teach my undergraduates, I emphasize the point that Mother Nature is throwing harder punches at us, but we are not passive victims. When you face an anticipated but ambiguous risk, a smart people and smart firms and smart governments will build in a set of strategies to cope with these new risks. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. And these coping strategies are not costless, but as more and more people seek these coping strategies, capitalism actually helps to induce such innovations. Elon Musk has become world famous for creating products that people want. Climate change creates such challenges for so many people that it actually unleashes capitalism to help us to cope. And folks, that's the big theme of my book. So this book is not a bestseller. Tian Fu, I'm hoping that I sell 3 copies tonight. So Yale University released my book, Adapting to Climate Change, Markets in the Management of an Uncertain Future. And guys, if you email me, I'll send you a free copy. And I am being recorded. Here's the quick overview of my book. Each of us seeks to be healthy, comfortable, and to raise happy children. Even I have that goal. Climate change threatens all of these goals. My book talks about how do we use human capital, our brains, and how do we use markets to better protect us. Folks, when I was in Singapore, I loved that Singapore had road pricing. I loved how the government was thinking through housing policy for the poor. Government plays a key role in helping citizens to adapt to climate change because government sets the rules of the game. And it's very important that government, whether in Singapore or in Indonesia or Malaysia or in India, that government create rules that encourage investment in adaptation rather than a moral hazard effect. Let me give an example there. In the United States, there is the worry among economists that when the government offers a bailout to locations hit with a natural disaster, that this actually attracts people to move to risky places because if there's a disaster, the government rebuilds there. So that's an example of government ex post insurance after disasters actually crowding out private self-protection. And economists are subtle about the incentive effects and the unintended consequences of well-meaning government policy. And Asia will be better able to adapt to climate change if government officials anticipate the strategic responses of firms and individuals in response to the well-meaning policies they enact. Folks, quickly, my book starts by talking about in the United States, but I think the lessons are relevant for Asia, How will different people's quality of life be affected by climate change? Singapore is a wonderful city, but it is hot. And it can be polluted due to the brown cloud smoke from Indonesia. If there is increased heat in Singapore, if there's increased smoke blowing over, how will different people in Singapore and throughout Southeast Asia adapt to these threats? The poor face the greatest challenges due to climate change. I think the leaders in Asia's nations have an imperative to help poor people get richer and to protect the poor by providing them with information if they live in risky places, efforts to improve the quality of their housing. In this age of big data, government officials should be paying close attention to do the poor differentially suffer on extreme weather days? And if the answer is yes, then there's a social justice imperative for the state to be aware of this and to take action. In the middle chapters of my book, I talk about classic themes. Folks, the United States has suffered from some horrible hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy. A silver lining of these stress tests is we're learning how our old infrastructure, New York City has an old subway, New Orleans did not have properly functioning levees. In Singapore, have the leaders been thinking about if a major hurricane hits, what infrastructure would be knocked out? And how much to invest in levees and other systems to protect the city? And Singapore's a rich nation. Can poorer nations in Asia already afford this infrastructure? Is the price of quality infrastructure declining because first movers like Singapore and the United States and Japan have gained practice with this? Folks, I'm very interested in productivity. Amazon is one of America's great companies. In choosing where to locate its headquarters, Amazon will not locate in a city whose quality of life it expects to decline. So if a city like a Phoenix, Arizona, is expected to be very hot in the future, an Amazon won't locate there. That actually creates an incentive for the leaders of that city to be proactive, to take steps to mitigate the threat of climate change. So while Singapore is a single city nation, throughout Asia, there is a system of cities. And I believe that cities and neighborhoods are going to compete against each other to offer good quality of life, because those cities and neighborhoods that are successful in mitigating climate threats of heat waves, fires, sea level rise, they're going to attract footloose people and jobs to move there. And so the competition to attract people and jobs actually creates an imperative to adapt to climate risk. Folks, we live in an age of big data. And one reason I'm optimistic about our ability to adapt to many parts of climate change is we have more and more big data from satellites and other techniques to know in real time what risks we have. A fire got within 3 miles of my Los Angeles house, and my wife packed her bags. She said if I wanted to leave with her, I should pack my own bag. She is the chair of UCLA economics, and she had real-time information from her cell phone about the risk she faced, and she was ready to run if the fire got closer. Folks, 3 more points before I wrap up. A point that has been made by progressives in the United States is the following. There is a concern that only rich people will be able to adapt to climate change, because if there's sea level rise, if there's fire risk, that there will be only a few points on the map that are safe. A point that I make in my book is if that's true, then we need to change our zoning laws. In Singapore, there's many 25-story buildings. Did you know that 60% of Los Angeles County is zoned for single-family housing? Imagine a different real estate zoning such that you could build Hong Kong-like density in Los Angeles. In that case, big data climate scientists will identify those areas that are on higher ground and that face less fire risk, and we will build taller buildings there. So the combination of pinpoint climate science combined with upzoning, building taller buildings where it's safe, will allow more middle-class people and poorer people to live in safer areas. But we have to change our zoning laws and regulations. Finally, we're going to have to eat in our future. And a crucial issue is keeping international trade going and lowering transportation costs so that we can ship goods. If Russia has a bountiful wheat harvest, to the ability to export that wheat to an area that didn't have a good harvest. So globalization is a friend of adaptation, because if there isn't globalization, then consumption equals local production, and that makes you quite sensitive to local shocks. So folks, a key idea from my book is the importance of human ingenuity. I skipped over Julian Simon's name before. Unlike other creatures, we have big brains. My brain is shrinking because I'm getting older. Perhaps I'm drinking too much. But there are 8 billion people on the planet, and we're going to be all seeking solutions to the new challenges we face. That creates a tremendous market for the young people, for the brilliant people at NUS and at USC and at other great universities. Human ingenuity, when we anticipate that we face a challenge, makes me optimistic that the best ideas funded by venture capitalists will help us to give us the tools we need to grow the food, to have vehicles that don't run on fossil fuels, to live in homes that can withstand flood and fire risk. Subject to the laws of physics, we have tremendous capacity here to adapt. So this is my final slide. To help Asia to adapt to climate change, I strongly encourage its voters and its people to allow prices to reflect scarcity. If water becomes more scarce, the price of water has to rise. If electricity becomes more scarce, prices have to rise. Asia's nations should invest in the best climate science to pinpoint the new risks we face. Folks, the third bullet point, the public needs to be educated about these risks to help them make good decisions for their family. Redfin is a competitor of Zillow in the United States, sharing housing information. Redfin is now partnering with First Street Foundation to share flood scores for American properties about what risks they face. I would love to see in Asia property owners having pinpoint information before they purchase a property about the heat, fire risk, and flood risk that the properties face. Folks, I made these other points before. I want there to be more housing built in relatively safer areas, so to change zoning rules. We need competition between Asia's cities, lower migration costs so that people can vote with their feet. If a place it scares them because of rising risk, the ability to vote with your feet to move, because competition facilitates adaptation. And finally, to anticipate the unintended consequences of government policy. With these new rules of the game, I am confident that this can help Asia's nations to adapt. The question is how much this will allow for adaptation, and that's why we need continued research on whether natural disasters are causing less damage. Folks, a final point from the father of Singapore. This was a quote from a newspaper article from a few years ago. Lee Kuan Yew was asked, what allowed for Singapore's growth miracle? Air conditioning. And so this is an example of the role that capitalist products can play in facilitating economic growth under extreme weather conditions. And this, I don't believe in magic here, but this is an example of how capitalism can help to insulate people from extreme threats to be productive. And with productivity, that creates income growth to give people the freedom to purchase the products, medicine, and safety inputs they need to thrive. Folks, I want to thank you, and I'm going to wrap up my talk right there.
Thank you, Prof. Khan, for sharing your insights. Next, we have Associate Professor L. Roman Carrasco with his presentation. Prof. Carrasco, please.
So, let me share my screen. See my slides? Yeah, everything is okay? Can you see the slides?
Yeah, everything looks good.
Yes, good.
I want to talk about climate change and how it threats urban well-being. So following from Prof. Khan's presentation, and I'm going to use Singapore as a case study, and I'm going to try to convey how nature-based solutions can help to preserve this relationship between nature and the well-being that nature produces. So I'm going to start by trying to see how climate change can affect the capacity of nature to deliver well-being and the different aspects. A framework that I find quite useful to frame this question is the one of ecosystem services. So we have, on the one hand, we have nature, and then nature produces ecosystem services to people. And then think, for example, when we go for a walk on Bukit-Timah Nature Reserve, we derive mental health and we are fitter, we exercise. So this combination can be seen in terms of supply. So nature produces a supply of services to people, and then we have a demand from people in every city.
Roman, can I interrupt for?
Yeah, sure.
I think your voice, I think your audio is not clear.
Is it too soft or?
Yeah, that's right. I think now it's better.
It's better like this?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry. Interrupt.
It's okay. So I was saying that, yeah, this framework is quite useful. So we have nature providing services to people, see it as a supply and demand, and people in Singapore, for example, would demand to have nature, to interact, have exercises. And there are several interventions that we can produce. Some of them are non-nature based. Like, for example, we can have trails with accessibility, toilets, facilities that increase supply and demand marine. Or we can have nature-based solutions like creating healthy environments and creating new green spaces to provide more supply. So when supply and demand meet, we have the benefits of nature for people. However, climate change is able to threat every aspect of this relationship between supply and demand. So, for example, supply can decrease because the ecosystem can suffer. Think of ocean acidification will threaten our coral reefs. Think of long droughts might threaten forests, and there might be massive die-off of the trees. So the quality of the ecosystem can suffer. In terms of the demand, when it becomes too hot, it might not be comfortable to go out for nature anymore, and we choose to stay outdoors. So basically, we are breaking the relationship between the supply and demand and the benefits that people can get from nature in the city. So as a result, these benefits are lower, and we might expect less happy human capital that is not as healthy as productive as a result. Okay, so because of climate change, we can expect a decrease in all these ecosystem services. From the supply side, if our ecosystems suffer, if they are not healthy, resilient, the benefits they provide will be lower. For example, our coastal protection from mangroves will be lower, flood control, water quality, water regulation, temperature reduction, all those services that are very important in cities under climate change will lower. So the same aspects that nature is helping to contribute to are being affected by climate change as well. But then from the demand side, it's also very important to understand the impacts. So Singapore as a city in nature is like a branding that we use to attract also investment, to attract human capital. So if we are not able to present ourselves as a city in nature, we are going to suffer in terms of our capacity to attract these investments, attract tourism, our recreation, and our own human capital is going to suffer in terms of less mental and physical health that we derive from our nature experiences. Okay, so my group has been trying to find evidence for the different aspects of this framework. So I'm going to first cover some of our work to try to understand how nature and nature-based solutions can contribute to well-being in cities. And the first question we had is whether having a nature dose, spending time in nature, was linked to life satisfaction. And this is some of the results. So we found that there was a threshold effect. So it's a bit like a recipe from the doctor. If you spend about more than 1 hour a week in nature, you are associated to have a higher life satisfaction. Other findings we found is that it's not only the time we spend in nature, it's about the diversity of the ecosystems we visit. So it's not just going to my neighborhood park, it's also being able to go to the mangrove, being able to go to the nature reserve, to the coastal park. These diversities also could be mentally stimulating, and I could explain this association. And then what we found also is that how we identify ourselves in nature, our nature relatedness score, has an interacting effect with the nature dose, the time we spend in nature. So if we spend 1 hour and we have a higher nature relatedness, we get a higher boost in terms of life satisfaction. So this study, what came to show is, yes, that there is a correlation between having nature and nature exposure and life satisfaction. So if we want this human capital in Singapore, nature seems to play a role for this human capital to feel satisfied with their lives. But we wanted to go a bit deeper. So we were thinking, is it only that we need to spend some time in the green space, or is it also related to the biodiversity of the green space, the species richness in the green space? So what we did is to bring students in some experiments, and we released them at different nature walks. And some of these nature walks are quite urban, but others are secondary forests, primary forests, and others are manicured trails in parks. And then we wanted to see whether the characteristics of the green space were going to determine their positive effect and the negative effect, the positive and negative mood, which are the precursors of our mental health. So we wanted to see what was the effect of the type of dose they received. These are some other trails, some of them were in landed properties areas. So this is a structural equation model, and what we found is there was a mediating effect. So when the participants perceive that the trail had high animal species richness, perceived biodiversity, they felt more restored. They relaxed more, and then through this mediating effect, they had a higher positive effect, a higher positive mood. So this is a preventive of conditions like depression, anxiety, stress. There was also a crowdedness level. The crowdedness reduced the positive mood. This effect was very similar when they perceive that there is high biodiversity. They're able to identify many different species. Then as a result, they have less negative moods. So to me, this was a very interesting experiment showing that nature-based solutions that are able to increase the diversity of our green spaces could contribute to mental health. So, and that can be quite critical, given how the disease burden is becoming quite high. So we established life satisfaction, we established the positive mood, negative mood relationships. We wanted to look whether there was some economic value to green spaces, and what were the ecosystem services that people in Singapore value most for green spaces. So what we did was a discrete choice experiment using a market research company in Singapore. And then we offer participants with different choice sets, characteristics of a potential new green space near where they lived. And then we had some service and conservancy charts to understand what was the park worth utilities. Also, it could be located at different distance, and they had different characteristics in terms of co-production and in terms of ecosystem services. So the aspect of the green space that people value the most was the capacity to reduce temperature. So this comes to signal what we were saying in the previous talk, that we are going to have a big increase in temperatures, especially in Southeast Asia, and being able to cope is very important. In Singapore, there are many HDB units that don't have aircon, if they don't have the resources and the income. So being near a green space is going to provide the services that will allow to cool down under the urban heat island effect. So that was highly valued. Okay, so we have established that nature and the potential to enhance nature could go a long way for humans in human well-being in Singapore. The next question is is climate change really able to disrupt this relationship between the supply and demand through changes in behavior? And we wanted to understand whether when it becomes too hot, people will stop going out to nature. They will stay at home. So we did this using mobile phone data, which I thought was quite interesting. We partnered with Intel, with one of the branches, and we focused on Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, our reserve, and then We wanted to observe through the mobile phone whether people were at home, they travel all the way to the reserve, how long they spend there. And then we also know their age and we know their ethnicity. So it was a very nice way to see their revealed behavior with regards to the nature reserve. And we could pair that with climatic conditions. So these are how the data look. These peaks you see are typically weekends, bank holidays, the number of visitors to the nature reserve increase. And then we can also observe from the different regions of Singapore, give us an idea of the travel cost that they incur to go to the nature reserve. And these are some of the results. So we found a threshold, and this threshold agrees quite well with previous physiological studies. So beyond 31.7 degrees is too hot, and we don't feel as comfortable. So what we observe is that the duration of the time that people spend in the nature reserve once we go beyond this threshold is lower. So indeed, what we are finding is that if it becomes too hot, people are gonna spend less time in nature, and that will have a trickle effect on their mental health and their fitness. So yes, climate change is a threat. And then finally, we have been doing some spatial optimization, trying to find places in Singapore when we have a mismatch between supply and demand. So we might have a lot of people, high density building occupation. However, we don't have a high level of green spaces reducing temperature. So here the red and the orange dots represent mismatch where we have more people on the higher percentile compared to the capacity to cool, to produce cooling services through nature. So this is very interesting because it shows places where we can have some real estate interventions to make sure that we have more density of green spaces and less population density to reduce this mismatch. Then you might think that there is some equity implications of this map, but actually we were looking at whether there was some bias in terms of income or gender distribution, family size, education, but there was nothing, right? So even though there might be some spatial differences, when it comes to identifying of the characteristics of the households that are subjected to these mismatches, actually there is no bias. It's very equitable. Singapore is one of the most equitable cities in the world in terms of provision of nature solutions from green spaces. And this is part of our policy. So we have a very nice mix of income that is not spatially segregated, same with ethnicity and same for housing types. So as a result, we have a very equitable provision of ecosystem services, although some areas of Singapore are gonna be more affected from climate change. So just to wrap up, nature-based solutions, we show that they can go a long way in providing well-being in terms of life satisfaction, cooling, mental health, and they have economic value. Then we see that also enhancing the biodiversity, so nature-based solutions trying to enhance biodiversity are gonna contribute to mental health, but climate change indeed is a threat. It's gonna affect behavior and might lower the capacity of our green spaces and the behavior of people to go to green spaces. And then we can work looking for real estate solution, spatial planning to try to make the most and minimize pockets of areas where it will be very hot and we don't have the cooling services from nature. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Prof. Carrasco. We'll now proceed with the Q&A session, which will be led by Prof. Singh. Prof. Singh, please.
Okay, thanks, Max and Roman. A very interesting presentation. I think there's a lot of comments, kind of points I think both of you have raised about economy and how capital market mechanism can help to reduce some of these climate change kind of issue. I think maybe I will start with some of the questions. I think for those of you all in the Zoom room, if you like to ask questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, and then you can either ask a question directly to the speaker, or you can also type your question in the chat room. I will read out some of these questions. I think the first question, maybe I'll just ask both the speakers. I think Matt mentioned very interesting about how to actually government roles in trying to mitigate some of these climate change impacts, whether it's rising sea levels, pollution, and so on and so forth. I think given difference in terms of economics status of different countries and also at different growth level, do you think it's actually difficult to impose a very common policy across country? Because some more developing country, they probably, I think you have written this book on environmental issue about Kushner curve. I think they are actually at the development stage, so they probably less concerned about the environment issue rather than the growth and the job impacts compared to other more mature economy in the region. How do you actually reconcile some of these problems, and trying to impose some policy, trying to impose certain rules to reduce some of these climate issue? I think the current COP26, I think they're also facing some of these issues, trying to strike a deal, to make sure everybody follows a very strict regular rule of reducing some of these pollutions, greenhouse effect, and so on. Anyone of you want to comment on this?
So I think this is a very important point that you raise.
Yeah.
I really liked Roman's presentation that I think even poor countries can partially embrace some of the nature solutions that he spoke about.
Mm-hmm.
In my book, I come back to his point that in rich countries, if we build skyscrapers for people to live in, that frees up land that can abate the urban heat island effect and that can act as wetlands to reduce flood risk. So one thing that poor nations can do to adapt would be to limit the ability of people to live in slums in certain parts of land. If certain land can be set aside as wetlands to offer the green benefits he talked about while avoiding flood risk. And so there's a little bit of threading the needle there. Tianfu raised a very important issue of what are the priorities of people in the poorest Asian nations. And if they met Greta Thunberg, what would they agree on? That if I were a very poor person in Vietnam or another country, would my first priority be climate change? And so Tianfu, I think that Singapore and the United States and other rich countries have an imperative to think about how we encourage these nations to develop while figuring out how to develop on a low carbon path, because I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I had that slide about the middle class aspirations of people in those countries because of their priorities. So you raise a key point. I think I want to hear from Roman, because I think he sketched out, while he focused on Singapore, I think several of his ideas could be applicable to nations, poorer nations in Asia.
Roman, any comments on?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree that the local solutions are feasible, and we can work on making the cities more resilient. Also, yeah, going back to COP, I think there were some discussions on packages to help low and middle income nations to preparedness for climate change mitigation. I think that's also the way to go. I mean, we have to recognize that we are highly developed because of our historical emissions, whereas some countries are developing now and they need to emit. So I believe in the importance of recognizing that historical debt and providing packages to help develop in a sustainable and resilient way. So to me, international payments for ecosystem services, which are very rare, would be a way to go. So maybe rich nations should contribute to countries like Indonesia to keep their forests and to help have policies to boost the economy in a way that doesn't involve trade-offs between destroying nature to produce economic development.
Right. Thanks for comments. I think coming back to the issue about mitigating the climate impacts, I think recently, I think about 2 years ago, the Singapore government actually announced really a very huge investment or long-term budget 100 billion trying to reduce these rising sea level impacts. I think they're looking into next 100 years. They're expecting the sea level may rise by 2 meters. So how to mitigate some of these rising sea level issue? I think the government actually announced this 100 billion kind of solution in various ways. I think we did a study. We found that actually quite interestingly, we find there's different responses in terms of the using the housing price, the private public market responses to this the climate change kind of solution. And interestingly, we find that, as Matt mentioned, I think that those in the public housing tend to be more responsive to some of these, to these 100 billions, even though it's take 100 years, kind of solution for the rising sea level. I think, I'm not sure whether you have any comments about some of these investment, because like Singapore case, government actually can plan ahead to mitigate some of these climate impacts. I'm not sure about other countries in terms of solving some of these problems, because a lot of time these pollutions, sea level rising being seen as a more like a public kind of public goods. People actually don't really pay for these goods, so it's a bit difficult. If there's no government intervention, do you think the capital market or the market-based kind of pricing mechanism can solve these kind of climate problems?
So two
Yeah,
thoughts.
yeah.
The United States has much more land area than Singapore. And during my trips to Singapore, I know the nation was building out using sand to increase its footprint. And so I can imagine that the nation is committed to making sure that there is significant land area to allow for population growth. Tien Phu, a couple of points. A benefit of globalization is, as great as Singapore is in engineering and other fields, the Dutch have a lot of experience with levies. Ideas are public goods. Researchers at Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, and Europe and Japan, Singapore can bring in the best ideas such that that $100 billion fund goes even further. You asked a fascinating question about discount rates. If this investment reduces sea level rise risk 30 years from now, should a 55-year-old guy like me care? And I hope the answer is yes, but there's always a question of time horizons.
Right.
But Tien Phu, here's what I'd have our friends thinking about. Singapore is a great nation. For it to continue to be great, there has to be an expectation that sea level rise won't destroy Singapore. If the government can make a credible commitment that it will keep back the oceans, foreign direct investment will continue to flow in. So my theory here is that this is about signaling to the rest of the world that Singapore will continue to be a world power. And that's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. But because I agree with you, I'm not really sure what's going to happen 30 years from now. I barely know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah. Thanks. Roman, any comments?
Yeah, in line with that, I think the announcement of the $100 billion, I think it gives a sense of stability, of preparedness, and I mean we already have tested the solutions, the engineering solutions. I think the solutions that remain to be tested probably are the ones that integrate nature solutions with engineering solutions. But I think in terms of Singapore and the real estate, knowing that we are ready to combat sea level rise, I think it provides a very stable market. Not the same for other small island states that might not have the capacity to provide a coastal defense around the whole island. So to me, those are the biggest losers from climate change. And when we look at economic impacts, it's not just the impact of having these small states disappearing, it's also the culture that will go with them and the human impacts. So even knowing that in the future your country might be covered by the sea, I think it has a very important mental health burden. So I think that's why we need to try to contribute and help these small island nations to also be prepared. if
And
needs be.
Tianfu, if I can, I agree with Roman. I have a chapter in my book that we need much more international migration. If the people from the Marshall Islands lose their island, I think that we need to make migration to the main United States much easier for exactly the reasons Roman sketched. But that shocks to places don't have to be shocks to people if we help the people to cope with the place-based shock.
Right. Yeah, interesting comment and suggestion. I think there are two questions in the chat room. Maybe I just read out the first one. How should climate change advocates respond to vested interest in fossil fuels like energy companies and others, those pollutive companies? How which vested interest and how should be the climate change solution help to solve this problem?
So that's an excellent and very difficult economics question.
Yeah.
A prominent economist wrote a provocative paper that environmentalists should purchase all the world's coal. So Tianfu, the opposite of a carbon tax is for environmentalists to purchase all the world's coal. Right. And so that would be that. So that's a property rights argument. And so I'm cracking half a joke, but I thought it was a brilliant paper by him. But of course, that would be very expensive. But that would be a way to say, okay, fossil fuel guys, you have the property rights here, and we're going to just purchase all your stuff and never use it.
Right. Robert, anything you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think big corporations are actors of change. So I think through education of consumers, we can put pressure for them to change. So and I believe they have the means. And we talk about innovation and new capital ventures. I think they offer a lot of hope. We just need to give the right incentives for them to harness their capacity into the right direction and shy away from fossil fuels.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure Lemping is still there. I think Lemping has been working on the carbon tax. I'm not sure whether Lemping would like to comment something on.
Hi. Yeah, so I think putting a price on carbon is important. I think that's been lacking for the longest time, and I think in our part of the world, Singapore is one of the few countries that has done that. But I think the price is being revised to reflect the true cost or the value of protecting those natural resource or natural capital. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and I completely agree that we in this region, as a relatively developed country in the region, we have the responsibility and the means to bring the other countries along with us on this journey, and then also build capacity in the region to help them better manage their resources and maybe leapfrog some of the costs of development in the next couple of decades.
Thanks, I mean, going back to Matt's comment just now, interestingly, we remember several years ago when we experienced these problems of haze pollution caused by the transboundary haze because of the forest, burning of forests from neighboring country. I think there's this attempt trying to enforce some of these transboundary pollution control. Even company trying to, as Matt mentioned, we try to use some social pressure, try to boycott some of the products produced by companies which are not really environmental friendly and so on. But if there's a transboundary kind of constraint, border constraint, do you think this enforcement of this property right or this, through this kind of social pressure, do you think this kind of solution will help when we actually deal with very diversity or very heterogeneous kind of issue, and also cross-border kind of constraint?
I think this is a very important point. The Nobel laureate William Nordhaus wants to create climate clubs where nations will put an import tax on a polluting nation's exports and will only reduce that tariff if the nation is clean. So Tian Fu, the Nobel laureate Nordhaus, to address your very important point, wants to create climate clubs. And I highly recommend that folks read his paper. I think it's a brilliant strategy to get, if the World Trade Organization allowed it, to get it, to address your very important point.
Right. Thanks. Roman, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I really like the idea of Nordhaus. I need to read the paper. I haven't read it. I think that would be a very important way. I think in the terms of the haze, we had the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, and we were saying, oh, it's toothless, right? We cannot really enforce Indonesia, but many of the companies that are developing land in Indonesia are based in Singapore. So I think it had effect as well. And it also signals some indication that there might be some liability if they are related to Singapore. So it's always the same problem that when it comes to the international arena, we cannot really enforce, but I like these indirect measures. They might contribute as well.
Right. Okay. There's another comments or question in the chat room by Sonny. They say, agree with Professor Khan that prices should reflect scarcity of key resources like water, electricity, gas, etc. But the political and sociological dimension are challenged. The poor will be deprived of access to such basic necessity. What is a US practice and experience? I think he probably talked about the Pareto optimal kind of question.
So Sunny raises a very important issue. And again, Sunny's point is, if we allow prices to reflect scarcity, that will be regressive as it lowers the purchasing power of the poor. Sunny is correct. So what California has done is it has sort of two-part pricing, price discrimination. You pay very little for water up to some allotment. And then if you're a Kardashian, if you're in Beverly Hills, you then pay more for water after that point. And so that's called an increasing block tariff. And so with an increasing block tariff for water or electricity, that would be a strategy to protect the poor. The only problem with that is it subsidizes a rich person like LeBron James on his water consumption up to that point. If we were willing if we knew people's incomes with good big data, the state could do a better job with price targeting. There's a question of whether the courts would allow for that. But in a social justice sense, I agree with Sunny, and I'd be comfortable with that if that were legal.
Roman, any comments on this Singapore context, pricing of some of these resources? Do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, letting the market reach an equilibrium, reflect scarcity, least efficiency, but we have market failure. So I agree that some sort of intervention, be it subsidy for low income households, I think is necessary to correct this problem.
Anyone from the floor or in the Zoom would like to also ask questions or make comments on the topics? Please feel free to unmute and then. If not, maybe I'll continue with the questions. I think Roman have actually made some interesting research on about creating awareness about the green environments and our green nature and so on. I think this part of the education and also creating awareness. Other than the creating awareness, do you think we should also have certain incentive or certain way to nudge people to be more green or more environmentally friendly or conscious? Conservation, in terms of conservation and environmental consciousness. Do you think the awareness alone can be sufficient to encourage or foster kind of good behavior?
That's a very interesting question. I think the behavioral economics of adaptation to climate change, I think there is so many things that can be done, and there are many interventions that we haven't explored. And I think probably we need something that is almost tailored at the personal level. Some people are very receptive. And that's something we find also when people that have high nature relatedness, I don't know if it's through education or it's something that comes with our genetic makeup or a combination of both. They are going to be much more receptive to behavioral intervention and nudges. But there are people that are very resistant. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a very stimulating area of research. And there might be something of critical mass. So I think once we have a number of people behaving in a certain way, I think the social norm changes. I think we might have suddenly everybody will be recycling or being more conscious about energy use or pushing for electric vehicles. But again, I think much research needed. There are a huge potential for nudges and behavioral interventions.
Right.
Tianfu, I'd like to add, Roman just raised a brilliant point about this sort of social multiplier effect. My teacher, Gary Becker, would call that the bandwagon effect. So if your friends post on Instagram great pictures of Matt in nature, or at least when I was younger, that would interest my friends and would attract them.
Yeah.
Tianfu, a new point.
Yeah.
In the United States, because many African Americans have lived in center cities for complex reasons, there's a concern that many have not visited national parks and national forests. So nature is an experience good. And so I think Roman was pushing us to a field experiment. If we actually paid people, if we randomized an incentive to visit nature, that this could induce demand if it's an experience good, as people learn that they love it and then vote to protect it.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I think, going back to the earlier point, this Romans mentioned about the supplies and the demands. I think green or environmental goods is always short in supply. But without intervention, do you think that there will be sufficient supply of all these green goods and environmental kind of products? You know, there's always this undersupply if the price mechanism are not perfect. And people,
as a University of Chicago economist, if capitalists sense that there's a demand for these products, right, I think that capitalism will deliver. So I saw excellent research out of NUS by Tianfu's colleagues on energy efficiency. And so if the price of electricity goes up, the new real estate buildings are going to be more energy efficient. So Tianfu's right that with durable capital, it takes a while to build new buildings, to build new cars, but the new capital that is built and sold will reflect the new fundamentals. So I actually think we need the capital stock to turn over more often. And at NUS, I bet the most energy inefficient buildings are the oldest buildings.
Okay. Yeah. Roman, do you think that by leaving it to the market, do you think we will have enough of this green part? Or?
I was thinking of some of our neighboring countries with these large areas of forest, and many of the ecosystem services are not captured by the market. So I think there is too much deforestation. If we factor in the benefits from forests, then the level of supply will change, and then I think we need some kind of intervention to put a price to reflect the actual value. I think the Ampin map, it was quite nice to see if we are able to put a certain carbon price, actually they are worth protecting, but deforestation is too much because the price is not recognized by the market. So I think it's an issue.
Right. And LJ is actually have a question to, any thoughts about how big data, IoT, or IT software technology can help to improve urban greening and sustainability? Roman, you want to start?
Yes. So imagine if you managed a building in Singapore, like at the Marina Bay, and imagine if you had data by hour on the humidity and temperature. You would know immediately from knowing the outdoor temperature and knowing the indoor temperature, you could see how electricity consumption varies within the building as a function of outdoor conditions. And so that would be an example of fine-tuning the building and thinking if you want to install better windows or a variety of civil engineering strategies to tighten up the building to help it to adapt to the weather conditions. So only by having real-time data on the performance of the building inside and the outdoor conditions can you really nail this. And that's the big data revolution's value added.
Interesting. Roman, any experience on this big data?
Yeah, I think it has a lot of potential. Looking on the demand side, on the behavior, I mean, researchers are using now social media to understand locations of people, where they are taking pictures. I mean, we use mobile data. Still, mobile data is fairly aggregated. There are some confidentiality issues, cannot go into the detail. But understanding the movement of people when it's hot, where do they go, where do they stay, what are the areas that are most important for them in terms of recreation. I think that wealth of information is very important for urban planning and real estate. So yeah, I think there is a big potential there.
Yeah, I think adding to Matt's comments earlier on this temperature, indoor and outdoor temperature, it's very interesting. We actually did a study or experiments using data from a hotel, using the temperature adjustment kind of behavior. I mean, we after controlling for the external temperature, indoor temperatures, we see how frequent people actually adjust the room temperature. We find that, I think other than some of these factors, external factors, internal factors, you find the other interesting factor that we see, because hotel actually receive visitor guests from different country. I think the origin of the country where these visitors coming tend to have some impact on how they actually have preference or adjustment to the temperature, whether they, we find that some people from some country, or especially the tropical climate country, they tend to prefer higher temperature instead of trying to adjust the temperature down. And those people from the hot country, they tend to actually want to adjust the temperature to the lowest, and then they leave it, at a very low temperature for a long time. I mean, this different culture, different behavior seems to also influence some of the behavior. It's even more complicated. We can have providing real time, but the behavior aspect, because of the cultural differences, much more difficult to control. Right. And anyone from the Zoom would like to comment or ask question before I wrap up the presentation and the session with my last question to the speaker? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you have any specific questions. All right, if not, maybe I'll just ask the last question to our two speakers. I think going back to Matt's earlier comments about zoning, it's a very interesting comments and also discussion about how Matt was thinking about using zoning rule to improve reduce these climate problems. I think living in Singapore, a high density country, we always aspire, about the abandon of land in US and California. I wanted to have more landed instead of having high rise. I think, Matt, you are suggesting a different solution. You want to have more high density developments in California to reduce some of these climate problems. I think by having more high density or increase the zoning in development area, do you think that will actually have not just a climate kind of impacts, but there will be other unintended consequences in terms of rising land prices and making places more expensive, and the poorest may be crowded out of these places? Do you think that will be some of these unintended kind of problems?
It's possible. So
Right.
Ed Glazer of Harvard once did a calculation that the whole world could live in the American state of Texas in 6-story buildings.
Right.
And so Tianfu, I meet many pessimists who say that young people are doomed because of climate change. And I say we're becoming an urbanized world. And there's just a question of where do we build our future cities? If the whole world could live in Texas, then you don't have to be a mathematician to see how many different permutations there are for where we could build our future cities. Now, you asked what might be the unintended consequences of building at Hong Kong density. In my 2010 book, Climatopolis, I argued that Los Angeles people would drive less and would use the subway if we actually lived at higher density. So I would say that I find Shanghai and Singapore very livable. Most Americans have not lived in apartments before. And so I believe that to adapt to climate change, we have to show more imagination and perhaps live our lives differently. And Singapore, despite the humidity, shows how good urban life can be. Even when one lives in a multifamily apartments. And so I'm confident as someone from New York City and who is a fan of Singapore, that America could move away, that the American dream doesn't have to be about single family homes. And that when we think about alternative ways to set up our cities, this sets aside land for all the things that Roman and biologists want to do with it. And I think that opens up additional adaptation possibilities.
Right. Roman, any comments on this?
Yeah, I think the zoning could have unintended consequences, but we know from Singapore that we are able to still keep a good mix and to avoid spatial segregation. So I think it's possible to have policies that try to steer people toward areas that are more suitable for living, and then if we combine them with perhaps having some quota of different income in the same building, I think it's possible. And Singapore shows that urban planning can lead to equity. So I think it could be prevented. But once we need to watch out for these unintended consequences. I agree.
Right. Well, and really like to thank the two speakers, Roman and Matt, for a very interesting presentation and also sharing and also discussing on some of the topics about climate change. Hopefully, adapting to climate change, we'll be able to do better in terms of not just doing the right thing, but doing things right as well. So to improve the climate change for the environments and lastly, I think we'll, before closing today's session, I would like to thanks again Lian Peng for this and his Center for Nature-Based Solution, Climate Solution, for the co-hosting this event. I would like to thank the two speakers, and also there are many people who actually help in putting together this event, Kochen, Nor, Susanna, Weichen, Seming, and I would like to really thanks also for your participation into this. I think now it's almost 10:15, I think, evenings in New York time. I don't want to hold Matt back for too long. And again, before closing this session, I would like to also to announce that we also have another e-seminar next week on investing for impact investing, or investing for good, doing the right thing or doing the thing right. If you'd like to participate or join the e-seminar, please register it through our website. And lastly, again, thank you very much for joining and participating in this event. Thank you very much, Matt and Roman and Lian Peng. Hope to see you all in person soon, either in Singapore, in New York, or in California.
Thank you for organizing. Thank you so much.